a very brief introduction to Jane. She's an emeritus professor of French at Durham University. Her speciality is medieval French romance, lyric poetry, and histories. And she's worked extensively on medieval revival of the 18th and 19th centuries, English writers and artists such as Alexander Pope, Walter Scott, and William Morris, and the French writer Victor Hugo, and the architect Viollet le Duc, who restored and remodeled Notre Dame. So in this particular context, she'll be telling us about Lyulph Tower, built as a hunting lodge in the 1780s by the Howard family of Greystoke Castle. It's quite interesting that because of some publicity of her talk, and it's prompted some letter exchange in the Cumberland Herald, and also discovery that one of our Zoomers today has actually lived in Lyulph Tower. So it'll be interesting to hear, maybe in the question and answer section, what she thinks about the presentation. It does not meant to unnerve you in any way.
Interesting, yeah.
So without further ado, may I ask Jane to start away? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's very nice. I've discovered that I'm the only person only academic ever to have been cancelled by wasps. It's quite a distinction. I'm going to live on it for some time. So let me start by introducing you to someone I rather doubt that any of us would very much have heard of. He's called William Gilpin, an 18th century cleric, artist, essayist, and who I believe is a very good starting point to understand the design and the placing of Lyulph's Tower. In 1792, William Gilpin published an essay called On Picturesque Beauty. And it's a really useful summary, I think, of what the later 18th century meant by the picturesque landscape. Gilpin's got very decided views. The picturesque, he says, is a particular kind of beauty which is agreeable or would be agreeable in a picture. A picturesque landscape is going to require things like roughness and irregularity and wildness. It'll provoke the excitement produced by what he calls the intricacies of wild, romantic, mountainous scenes. But he insists that for artistic purposes, wildness needs to be rendered manageable by human mediation. In pursuit of the picturesque, he says, he visited Scotland, but he'd been pretty unimpressed. Scottish landscapes, he said, were certainly wild, but Scotland's unmanaged wilderness produced nothing but dreary wastes, and only too often offered the viewer nothing but one general blob. Wildness, he says, to be artistic and hence picturesque and to appeal to sensibilities, needs to be enframed. It pleases only when it's given shape and transformed into what he calls a prospect view, a view that is appropriate and admired in a picture, and which will involve not just nature, but human agency. You can see what he means by, you can see what he means by looking at his own landscapes. The prints he uses to illustrate his own travelogues, particularly the observations on the Lake District of 1786, usually of savage landscapes, a commonly given focus precisely by the presence of the human, sometimes tiny figures. You can just see the tiny figures here, I think. Difficult to detect, and elsewhere, dramatic buildings, often, as here, a sort of generic medievalness. And by the way, interestingly, in the observations, Gilpin explains in quite a lot of detail methods for constructing artificial ruins to ground the viewer's imagination and focus the view to stimulate the emotions and engage the imagination of the viewer. Lyulph's tower, of course, was and is no ruin. On the contrary, it was and is a sturdy country house. But to a William Gilpin, its architecture, the ersatz medievalness, would have made it just the sort of focalizing building that he and his contemporaries required to turn a landscape from merely savage to desirably picturesque. Now, that may seem to be a bit of an indirect way of approaching the subject of Lyulph's tower, but the tower can't, I think, be discussed without paying some attention to its wilderness setting and to the concept in particular of the picturesque, as understood by Gilpin and by the artists, landscape designers, viewers of the late 19th century. Lyulph's tower was part of the Gowbarrow estate. You can just see, I think, here, the Gowbarrow Park, which is the larger hunting estate, with Lyulph's tower just at the bottom, airy force just above. So part of the Greystoke estate. Was part of Gowbarrow Park, which in turn was part of the Greystoke estate, based in Greystoke Castle, about 7 miles to the north, and which had become by marriage one of the estates of the Howard family, Dukes of Norfolk. Its wilderness setting is geographically deeply imbricated with its surroundings. Ullswater itself, the Gowbarrow range above it, and especially the highly romantic landscape that is Aire Force. And in the 1780s, and therefore just as the building of Lyulph's tower was in progress, the 10th Duke and his son, the 11th, who is going to be the major focus of today, his son, the 11th, were overseeing the landscaping of Aire Force. The transformation of, this incidentally, I think, is that modern view of Aire Force. The transformation of what was originally a pretty rough and inaccessible mountain torrent into a pleasant pleasure garden. They'd been being, as it were, pioneers in curating a picturesque landscape. They'd planted trees, they'd laid out woodland glades, they'd planned and constructed the walkways and paths that are still the basis for those of today. They built dramatic bridges, and this bridge looks decidedly rickety, I think. I should think today they'd be in trouble for public safety, wouldn't they? They built dramatic bridges, they'd identified and cleared viewpoints and vistas, they'd sought, as contemporaries might have said, harmony in wildness, prospect views. In short, they provided a glorious example of the picturesque, of wildness redesigned to inspire feeling. And do read on this subject, incidentally, on the Friends website, Emma Bray's very nice piece on Aire Force and early tourists.
She's here. She's in the room.
Oh, I'm so glad to meet you. I so much enjoyed reading that. It was really interesting, I thought. I hope I'm not just repeating you. What they'd done was to create a desirable landscape for walking. Ladies and gentlemen could walk, I was about to say securely, but doesn't look very secure, could walk securely across a landscape fraught romantically with menace and discover terrifying but managed delights at every turn. Now, of course, that sounds ridiculous. People have always walked, if only just to get from place to place. But by walking here, I'm thinking of something rather different. The sort of walking that 18th century commentators called perambulation, and a modern historian has called self-conscious pedestrianism. There we are, we all probably indulge in it. Walking became part of polite culture in a way inconceivable in earlier centuries. In the 18th century, however, and even in cities, planners incorporated promenades, parks, public walks, in which the more genteel and leisured members of society might exercise and socialize. A German tourist in London, Karl Minetz, who in Germany had never encountered anything similar, was astonished by the number of people who, in fine weather, resorted to Greenwich Park and Greenwich Park's exquisite pleasures. A walk through nature, particularly, was thought to promote health and recreation and inspire aesthetic appreciation, melancholy contemplation, and philosophical reflection. So the next time I walk up here, I shall think philosophically. In fact, sheer contemplation of nature came to be regarded as an important pursuit for the cultivated, and to be able to display a correct taste in landscape became a valuable social accomplishment. Walking, as it were, is a sort of fine art. Walks like the Air and Force walk, so carefully and expensively, I imagine, planned by the dukes, were laid out by private landowners who could then indulge themselves by inviting or permitting visitors, tourists. Remember, for instance, in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth and her friends, the gardeners, head to Derbyshire, confidently expecting that they will be able to walk round Fitzwilliam Darcy's park at Pemberley, admiring its charming views. Now, of course, if you've been admiring the wild and exciting landscape of Air Force, to discover Lyulph's tower does require another short walk, a little extra effort. Most of us here, I think, will probably have discovered it first as a bit of a hidden gem, visible from the Ullswater Way. You head up the side of Green Hill towards Gowbarrow, look down to the right towards the lake, and just glimpse a rather odd building slightly obscured by trees. Looks like a nice, long, low, late Georgian farmhouse, typically Cumbrian. White painted, 2 stories. But the oddness, of course, is what we can glimpse behind the house, something very different. 4 substantial towers joined by a range of castellated walls. The whole building, in fact, looks oddly hybrid. As Jane Firth says on her item on the Friends website, the tower was built in the 1780s by the 11th Duke of Norfolk to act as a hunting lodge for his deer park, Gowbarrow Park. It's sometimes said to be built on the site of a ruined peel tower. Visit Cumbria says it is itself a renovated peel tower. But I must say, I've looked assiduously and I haven't been able to find any concrete evidence of that, though that doesn't mean it isn't, of course, correct. But of course, if we're thinking of ourselves as 18th century visitors or tourists in search of the picturesque, we're really looking at Lyulph's tower from the wrong direction. We must surely want to see it from the road along the lake, or perhaps even from the lake itself, from which angle, unambiguously, we can admire battlements, towers, round arch windows, everything nicely, oh dear, I'm sorry, I keep on losing my place. Everything nicely consistent, everything seeming to be the very expression of the medieval. But more particularly, if we're in search of the true picturesque, we're meant to see it as, I think, in this wonderfully misty, romantic, late 18th century print of the 1790s, after work by a certain Joseph Farrington, where the tower shown very much out of proportion and rather inaccurately looms dreamily white like a fairy tale castle, and where crucially it becomes unambiguously medieval, a defensive tower set in just the sort of picturesque, wild, romantic mountainous scene that provides just that focus that William Gilpin had thought proper for the picturesque. I'm going to come back to Farrington, but what I want to suggest here is that our 11th Duke, as well as providing for himself and his guests a useful hunting lodge, also provides a rather exotic building, which is the very essence of the picturesque, as theorized by artists and writers, but is available especially to the walker, and which focuses the attention of the onlooker, which is in some ways the human focus for the landscape of Gowbarrow Park, and is also a culminating adornment to a landscape rendered newly, thrillingly dramatic. But first, another byway. Those of you who are local, and I think perhaps most of us are, those of us who are local may by now be thinking that they've seen something a wee bit similar, a bit further north, something today known as the Greystoke Follies or Folly farmsteads. You could just see at the top centre the word Greystoke, which is where the castle and the estate proper begins. It's also a culminating adornment to a landscape newly rendered thrillingly dramatic. If you drive along the B5288 out of Greystoke village towards Penrith, you'll see to your right, presiding over the village, what looks like a rather imposing, well-preserved little medieval castle. Another crenellated hexagonal fort. Oh dear. I'm so sorry. Yes. A notice by the entrance to the drive tells us that the castle is called Fort Putnam. And if we venture along the drive and through the imposing gate, Fort Putnam, I should stress, is not open to the public. We find that those stout walls are roughly U-shaped and that this apparent fort conceals another rather nice, typically Cumbrian, late 18th century farmhouse, barns, a cowhouse, and so on. In other words, this is another ambivalent building with architecture suspiciously like that of Lyulph's Tower. Drive a little further towards Penrith, and on the right again, we come to a second pseudo-medieval Greystoke folly, this one called Bunker's Hill. Today, it's a particularly nice dairy selling utterly good raw milk. But if you don't look too closely, you swear that it was another well-preserved medieval castle, hexagonal walls, crenellations, Gothic windows and all. And just to complete the set, there's one more Greystoke folly across fields to the left. This time, what could be another smallish tower, this time crowned with an elegant spire. Could be one of those small defensible medieval churches. Well, no, it's another folly, a mock castle tower with spire built to adjoin a standard, rather nice Cumbrian farmhouse. And perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised to find that all three follies were also commissioned in the 1780s, just like Lyulph's Tower, by the patron and local landowner, none other once again than the 11th Duke of Norfolk, Charles Howard. And once again, in the Gothic mode that he favoured. Again, I don't think we can consider Lyulph's Tower without relating it to the Greystoke Follies, which were designed and built at very much the same time, and which share something of the same idiom, and which do seem to pander to the fashion for decorative buildings, follies on country estates in 18th century England, focusing especially on the latter part of the century, follies in what I've been calling the pseudo-medieval mode, although contemporaries, of course, referred to it as the Gothic. Imagine for a moment that you're the wealthy owner of a sizable country estate, but one with no very obvious prospect views, as Gilpin had it, or charming views, as Jane Austen says. How are you going to make your estate a place renowned for providing encounters with the sublime, a place where genteel tourists like Elizabeth and the gardeners can walk and admire? One answer, of course, is to redesign your parkland and gardens, to lead visitors down a path to some striking object, a destination, like a fountain, a statue, an open prospect, a glorious building, which will inspire exalted pleasures. Take, for instance, the rather magnificent estate some of you may have visited, Stour Head in Wiltshire. In 1717, the house and its vast estate was sold to a very wealthy banker called Henry Hoare, who built a positively palatial house in what is known as the Palladian style, meticulous symmetries, classical colonnades, temple fronts. Over the period between 1717 and 1760 or so, Henry and his son, another Henry, executed a complete remodeling of the estate and its gardens. At every turn, follies, Grecian, glorious temples are made the centerpieces of beautifully artificial lakes, the culmination of hills and mounds. To take a couple of examples, in woods carefully designed to have darker conifers, alternating with paler green oaks and beeches, two monuments, among others, stand overlooking an artificial lake and creating glorious vistas. The harmoniously lovely Pantheon, built in 1753, there's an 18th century print of the same scene with, one can just see two visitors in the bottom left there, very tiny. And the Temple of Flora, built in 1744 to 46. This is a landscape meticulously curated. The visitor's meant to find him or herself walking, wandering, open-mouthed with admiration through a beautifully classical landscape, fashionable landscape, which would stimulate pious thoughts and benevolent actions. A beautifully classical landscape. In the 1740s, the Palladian style that I've been looking at here for Stour Head was the fashionable design for decorative gardens, garden buildings, follies in the most fashionable English circles. Another example, rather closer to home perhaps for our 11th Duke on his Greystone estate, was the estate of Castle Howard in South Yorkshire, designed and built by our 11th Duke's Howard kinsmen, the Earls of Carlisle, who are also scions of the Howard family. Almost everything there is Palladian, austerely classical, strict symmetries, elegant pillars and pilasters and cupolas. The magnificent opulent house and its elegant park, which some of you will remember, I think, for the setting for the TV series Brideshead Revisited, had been completed in 1720, in the 1720s, to designs proposed by John Benborough and completed by Nicholas Hawksmoor. The house itself is a real showstopper, but Hawksmoor also designed for the park, and in the same idiom, a truly show-stopping Follies, which are the very pinnacles of the Palladian. This, the magnificent mausoleum, intended as a private burial place for the Carlisle Howard family. Horace Walpole, whom I'll come back to in a moment, was a great admirer. He said, it's a building that would tempt one to be buried alive, which seems a bit excessive. He was on a walking tour through Yorkshire at the time, so walking yet again. And a Temple of the Four Winds, this one is, I think, my favourite of the Palladian buildings. And a Temple of the Four Winds completed in 1738, and which was intended as a tranquil place for reading and contemplation, and probably picnics, since there was a rather nice, convenient kitchen in the basement. Both of them are studiously designed for imposingness, visibility. They're what I called vista closers, approached via broad grassy rides through the woods. They're artfully placed on mounds or rises in the landscape. They shape and dramatize the landscape, create a mood or an emotion in the onlooker. But to get back to Lyulph's Tower and the Greystone Follies, no longer Palladian, of course, but Gothic, there'd been a distinct change in decorative building, something you can track rather nicely by the evidence of Stour Head. In 1772, for Stour Head, Henry Jr., apparently known as Henry the Magnificent, commissioned something in an aesthetic completely different from the rest of his Palladian estate, something called Alfred's Tower, which very different, which commemorates King Alfred raising his standard here in 879 to rally his troops. It's distinctly odd in all ways. It's not terribly medieval, really. It's 130 feet tall, brick-built, triangular, carefully positioned on a hill on the estate, with a dramatic viewing platform on top. But architecturally, and particularly surprising in this ultra-fashionable Palladian estate, it's Gothic, as is a rather cute little Gothic cottage, which was built at the same time, also at Stourhead. And by the time that our 11th Duke was refashioning Greystoke Park, Gothic had become pretty well the default mode for decorative landscape building. So, where did this new fashion come from? Well, it was fostered by a renewed passion for the study of things like stained glass, illuminations, rediscovery of Arthurian legends and border ballads. Horace Walpole, whom I mentioned a moment ago, has some claim to be the pioneer of the Gothic revival of the mid-18th century. In 1749, he commissioned the building of his remarkable showpiece villa in Twickenham, Strawberry Hill. To advise him on the design of what he called my little Gothic castle, Walpole appointed a committee on taste. The result is this playful gingerbread Gothic, a delightful muddle of turrets and pinnacles and battlements and pepperpot towers, Gothic windows, Romanesque arches, and with a startlingly interior decoration, really startling, all sumptuous plasterwork and flamboyant Gothicness. It's interesting to note that Walpole opened his castle to the public, but with a strict limit on numbers of only 4 visitors a day, and absolutely no more, and absolutely no children. Interestingly also, as it happens, Walpole was a novelist whose Castle of Otranto of 1764, based, we're told, on a nightmare of his own, crystallizes much of the appeal of the Gothic. It opens, gloriously absurd, with the death of sickly young Conrad, who's the heir to the castle, crushed to death by a gigantic helmet falling on him from an upstairs floor. It's based, and it includes a dastardly count, a persecuted heroine, a giant ghost, talking portraits, all of them pursued and pursuing through a castle replete with dungeons, secret tunnels, haunted towers, and so on. This highly atmospheric image from a Victorian reprint of Otranto sets the scene. It's medieval gloom. That is the dastardly Manfred on his way to pursue the heroine. And there are things happening, evil spirits flying up into the ceiling and so on. You probably remember Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, with the heroine Catherine terrified that an abbey, Northanger Abbey as it happens, would have to have all sorts of Gothic horrors. The Gothic mode in architecture and literature soon became remarkably mode-ish. Perhaps the most spectacular example from the 1790s was William Beckford's Fonthill Abbey, still in 1810, in its prime. But do notice on this second slide that, that having been built in a hurry and rather on the cheap, as so many such medieval buildings were, by inexperienced local builders, you don't find many local builders who build castles. It's falling into equally spectacular ruin only about 20 years later in the 1820s. Such a Gothic infusion is the very epitome of the picturesque 18th century landscape designers like Vanbrugh or Hawksmoor or Capability Brown prided themselves precisely on the creation of painterly landscapes in which an artfully placed building would draw the eye and lend perspective. Unsurprisingly, a good number of those buildings would borrow the highly fashionable neo-medieval Gothic mode. Few landowners would be lucky enough to have something Gothic ready-made. Dunscombe Park, for instance, in North Yorkshire, had distant views of the magnificent ruins of Rievaulx Abbey, and viewpoints were designed, as from the 1790s, to show it off to best advantage. But if you didn't have a tame ruin to hand, then the obvious thing to do was to build one, a folly, as witness a couple of my favourites. The aptly named Sham Castle, advertising exactly the truth. Sham Castle, the aptly named Sham Castle in Somerset, built in 1762, or the ruined Gothic castle at Hagley Hall, meticulously constructed in 1748. Contemporary pictures show it almost identical. It isn't that it's fallen down since the end of the 18th century. That was how it was intended to look. Which is, of course, where we came in with our 11th Duke building his follies on his Greystoke estate in that highly fashionable Gothic mode. All of his Gothic extravaganzas are designed for maximum visibility, and particularly so that mistily mysterious castle, ideally to be glimpsed from Ullswater. But what in particular might have lain behind the Duke's flurry of Gothic pastiches in the 1780s? Well, first, by the 1780s, the Greystoke estate already had quite a nice portfolio of authentic medieval buildings. Greystoke Castle itself, for instance. Which was actually really built around a peel tower, had been slighted in the Civil War and left largely ruinous. It had now been much restored and extended by the 10th and 11th Dukes. In addition, in 1783, our Duke's father, the 10th Duke, had acquired another authentically medieval 16th century mansion. Manorial Hall, Johnby Hall, in the village of Johnby, just north of the castle grounds. The hall again is actually built onto a 14th century peel tower. And perhaps inspired by this genuinely medieval heritage, our 11th Duke had had built for the Greystoke head gardener a handsome little Gothic mansion called Stafford House. Nice work if you can get it. And Stafford House in the Greystoke Park. It's complete with nice Gothic battlements and pointed arch windows. But the existing Howard Gothic portfolio on Cumbria, alas, is not much on display. The castle's invisible from any road. Johnby Hall has always been set back from the little road between Greystoke and Johnby and can only be glimpsed through trees. Stafford House is built on the estate proper and not easily accessible. Might our 11th Duke quite simply be looking for a nice little public display of fashionable Gothic splendour, to rival, admittedly on a very much reduced scale, the by now rather outdated Palladian, unromantic elegance of Castle Howard? Might our 11th Duke be creating a landscape as his kinsman had indeed done at Castle Howard, on a much less lavish scale, but particularly fashionable? Might he in particular be curating a borders landscape, a particular and specific landscape? A landscape, in other words, drawing on the long and dramatic history of border warfare, peel towers even in small villages, towns like Penrith guarded by castles. So what about the little Gothic castle on the side of Ullswater? The Greystoke Follies have, it turns out, this is Fort Putnam and Bunkers Hill, just for a reminder. The Gothic Follies, the Greystoke Follies have, it turns out, one of the essential components of the folly, a humorous term. This is unsurprising. The Duke, sometimes known as the Drunken Duke, was a larger-than-life character, probably best illustrated by this portrait from 1816, and contemporary accounts describe him as a stout, rather loud, coarse figure, part of the rackety set around the Prince Regent, unapologetically eccentric and rather uncouth. Brennan's Dukes of Norfolk says he was self-asserting and aggressive, jealous of his dignities, but loud and coarse in manner and in person, bon vivant and given to overindulgence in liquor. He's said to have been averse to washing, so much so that his servants would wash him by stealth, it said, at night when he fell into a drunken sleep. More to the point, for our purposes, he was sometimes known to enjoy a joke. Spire House, for instance, according to family tradition, was built in the absence of the neighbour by a neighbour who was annoyingly sanctimonious. And of course, anybody who knows anything about early American history and the War of Independence will know that the Putnam of the Greystoke Folly, Fort Putnam, refers to a General Israel Putnam, who was a bit of a scourge of the British during the Revolutionary War, and who notably fought valiantly at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, a June 1775 victory for the American revolutionaries. The Duke, it turns out, was a supporter of independence for America, and given that that war had ended only in 1783, the names of his follies are perhaps unwisely resonant. They do look gleefully provocative and rather subversive, and we need to remind ourselves that a decade later, in 1798, the Duke was deprived of his high offices of state when at a gathering in a tavern in London, rather than toasting His Majesty the King, as was conventional, he toasted the majesty of the people. When we remember that as Duke of Norfolk, our 11th Duke was hereditary Earl Marshal to the Crown, its champion and defender if required, head of the College of Arms, organizer of coronations, the names of his follies seem distinctly subversive and must be designed, of course, as a bit of a joke. But is there anything folly-ish about Lyulph's Tower? I know I've actually been skirting the question so far, not least because it's complicated by the fact that definitions of folly vary enormously, to the extent that the National Trust Guide to Folly says, rather despairingly, that the term folly is ultimately subjective, so a precise definition is not possible. It seems a bit sad when you're writing a book about follies, but never mind. Most definitions turn around the idea that a folly is constructed primarily for decoration. But it's not, it should be said, exclusively so. Might a perfectly serviceable hunting lodge disguised as a medieval castle meet the criteria? After all, many follies do have identifiable uses. There's a railway tunnel, for instance, at Haywards Heath, as well as an ice house at Compton Verney. So what about Lyulph's Tower? The name Lyulph had particular resonances, Greystoke resonances for the Howards. After the conquest, the lands were granted to the existing landowner, a certain Saxon lord, Lyulph or Lyulph or Sigulf, who built the first wooden tower in what is now Greystoke proper. The first actual stone-built tower was built considerably later in 1129. The tower's name was particularly apt, firmly grounded in Greystoke history and also delightfully mysterious, especially for a mock castle on Ullswater. It invites discovery as a reward for a little more effort, and I return to the Farrington print again, with its unrealistically gleaming white castle, its turrets and towers which you'd swear were fairy tale. We can't judge how accurate the landscape it is, but it's so carefully and artistically curated with artfully placed clumps of dark trees setting off the fairy tale tower, which is placed just so in the vertical line below a col, concealed in cloud between those rather unlikely rock faces and illuminated theatrically by a mysterious shaft of sunlight. And of course, the careful patterning of castle and reflection, which I think we should particularly note. You can just see it, I think. It's a particularly harmonious and tasteful landscape created for sensibility and inviting an emotional response. And of course, it provoked just that, with what would surely have been the 11th Duke's dream tourist, William Wordsworth. Many of you will remember that the great walker, and again, I know you'll have heard much about him and his sister in Jeff Houghton's talk on the Wordsworths in the Lake District. were here? No.
Yes, was it this room? I'm not sure.
Oh, no, I meant I'm so pleased to meet one of your people. I was wondering if we had some more. Wordsworth, in his Guide to the Lake District of 1835, claims that walking once along the side of Ullswater, he'd noticed an odd optical effect. He saw, deep within the bosom of the lake, a magnificent castle with towers and battlements. Nothing could be more distinct than the whole edifice. After gazing with delight upon it for some time, as upon a work of enchantment, I could not but regret that my previous knowledge of the place enabled me to account for the appearance. It was in fact a reflection of a pleasure house called Lyulph's Tower. That odd, romanticized vision, almost an echo of the vignette provided by Joseph Farrington, may explain the enthusiasm with which in his The Somnambulist of 1828, he embraces the story of Sir Eglamour and Lady Emma of Lyulph's Tower, their faithful love, Sir Eglamour's departure on knightly adventure and crusade, Emma's tragic sleepwalking death in the deep pools of Ereforth, Sir Eglamour's retreat to life as a hermit, Lady Emma's occasional haunting presence. Scholars are still divided over whether this particular story was really already legendary in the 1780s, or whether it's Wordsworth's own invention. There are indeed three distinct works based on a Sir Eglamour, Shakespeare's Two Gentlemen of Verona, about 1590, which has a rather feeble and cowardly knight of that name who fails to protect his lady, a Middle English romance of about 1350, Sir Eglamour of Artois, in which the hero battles for 4 whole days to kill the ferociously horrible boar of Sidon, and a broadside ballad or traditional folk song in which a Sir Eglamour, as it says on the title page of the edition of 1672, manfully slays a terrible, huge, great, monstrous dragon. No sign in any of these of a Lady Emma, still less of Ereforth or Ullswater. Of course, it may be that a fourth and different story of Sir Eglamour and Lady Emma was orally transmitted, but might it perhaps be that glorious, harmonious, and sentimental depictions like that in the Farrington engraving invite just such sensibilities, that Wordsworth, perhaps remembering Sir Eglamour from his random reading at some stage, that Wordsworth's story is a reaction to the painterliness, the picturesqueness of the landscape, perhaps a reimagining, perhaps an invention. After all, a medieval castle, however sham, did rather demand a matching medieval legend. And here was a medieval legend, fully fledged. Was the legend Wordsworth's invention? We're so used to thinking of him, I think, as a lyric poet, that these days his narrative poetry, think of The Wanderer or The Idiot Boy, is often forgotten. But if this is indeed Wordsworth's invention, it's interesting evidence of the power exerted over the landscape of Gowbarrow Park by that slightly mischievous presence of Lyulph's Tower on the lakeside. And certainly the function of the architecture and the placing of Lyulph's Tower was to provide a Gothic centerpiece. It was a success. It now had everything: a wild forest setting, a Gothic architecture, a mysterious and resonant name, and now, crowning requirement, a tear-jerking legend. As we've seen, for an artist of the period, it is visually the epitome of the picturesque. Now, for the visitor, it's also designed as the epitome of the romantic. If to be picturesque, a landscape requires something on a human and legendary scale, then the tower's a fitting complement to the wild landscape of Ereforth. One commentator, you might remember, one commentator suggests indeed that the Forth is Lyulph's Tower's back garden. I read that somewhere and didn't notice, and I've forgotten. It's also a thought-provoking addition, a new and more serious adornment to the Duke's domain, Gowbarrow Park. The Duke, we should remember, had as his family seat the glorious and totally authentic Arundel Castle, built for the most part in the 1150s. Is it fanciful to imagine that Lyulph's tower is in miniature, an echo, even a riposte, fittingly reminding the historically minded visitor or tourist in little of the grandiose Arundel Castle and the venerable dynasty of the Howards? Thank you very much.
Wow, would you mind just turning the lights on? Wow, what a tour de force. That was fascinating. I don't know whether anyone does guided tours of Follies in Ullswater.
Actually, that would be
It would be a fantastic thing to do. I had absolutely no idea there were so many wonderful places to see. I don't know. Maybe it's a project that you can think of.
I may be a little bit old for taking walks about, but it is fascinating. You could actually do a nice circular walk around the Greystone Follies.
And where does Lyulph fit in all this? This is not...
Well, Lyulph is quite a long way away, of course, but I suppose there's a similar sort of aesthetic at play, isn't there?
Yeah.
I think I ran out of time. I think otherwise I'd be, as you can imagine, with Gothic sort of imaginings. I thought I had to stop here.
If anybody has a question, I can put it in the chat.
Yeah. Have you got any questions in the chat?
No.
Okay. Let us start with the room. Are there any questions that anyone would like to pose? And of course, I'm very happy to take questions from the Zoom watchers as well. Anyone would like to pose a question?
Can I make a few observations from the back of the room? My name's Frank Barber. I've had the privilege of looking after livestock for about 60 years and Spire House and Thorpe. So I'm quite familiar with these two dwellings. I'm not quite sure how far we said it was since Lifetown was originally built. The Kirk Hall. What's the date to think it was constructed?
It's in the 1780s again, isn't it? Yes.
It's quite a lot, what I would call a rougher vernacular architecture than Bunkershill or Putnam. And the Spire House element, it touched upon the Quaker farm, who was the farmhouse on the end, which you can tell is a vernacular farmhouse, with the church spire stuck on the end of it. And my grandfather told me he was also in the construction industry. And he told me that Henry Charles Howard, which was best described as eccentric, asked the Quaker farmer how he'd like his house extension built. And he said, well, I don't care how you build it, as long as it's like a church. He built it like a church. And of course, that house has actually been developed in three places. The first was the little old farmhouse on the left-hand side, and then the spire and the tower, and then in the farmyard there was an extension up there again. So it's had three evolutions. To my mind, spent a lot of time in Lyulph's tower itself. The curtain wall idea with the lean-to structure inside, it very much looks as though it was for a hunting lodge, a place of pleasure and entertainment. And of course then they built the bit in the back, which is now like a normal farmhouse, which contains a kitchen and other. But the original curtain wall is occupied, and it's quite an amazing place. The biggest problem with it is keeping the Ullswater weather.
Yes.
And of course at the moment you probably noticed if you around that Ullswater way that there's been some extensive work going on with the covering the outside with a lime render and finish, which possibly was how it was many years ago, and it fell off and people just put cement in, and of course it started to penetrate. And the current owner has had to spend an exorbitant amount of money. That is, but you're not going to have to some work. And so,
could you just repeat again, you've been involved yourself for, just for the benefit of people on the Zoom, you've been involved yourself for 60 years, did you say, in the renovation of?
I'm 48-year-old, so I left school at 15, joined the family business, and we worked for the Howard family. And of course, the farm was at Spirehouse, and the farm was at Fort Putnam. A little bit of Bunkerson, but not very much. But Fort Putnam is, to my mind, is just a copy from the template of lifestyle. I think it's the idea of the curtain wall with the lean-tos in, you know. And so that's my take on it, you know.
And that's really interesting, actually. I would have loved to go. I would love to go and look at the inside of the house. I did once post a letter through their door saying, "I am respectable, and I would really rather like to come and look," but I never got a reply, and I rather regret that. But I'm coming out of the blue. They were probably
It's owned
thinking.
by a family that live in London. Of course, they're just here at weekends. It's a holiday home, basically.
It's an extraordinary building, isn't it? I did wonder about whether it was originally lime washed. That wonderful whiteness that you see on the Farrington print looks to me as though it might have been completely lime washed.
Well,
but
a lot of places were, because
Yes.
these farmhouses,
Yeah.
and sometimes they put clay on it to make it darker. But I can tell you that the process has been going on for 5 years of the external walls, and there's been quite a lot of work in getting the right shade of white grey. But white would be too much, just like a complete gasoline.
I think that's
We're going to get a shade of dark, so it just doesn't look as though it's been brand new.
so slightly cream coloured.
Yeah, it's quite a mixture. I can't give it a formula. I know it's
No, it's probably a professional secret too. But the extraordinary whiteness of the Farrington Castle, as I say, has made me think that perhaps it was lime washed, and that has actually disappeared. There aren't any traces left.
Well, when I first started working there, part of the thing was the stone just pointed with cement, which is wrong.
Yeah.
And the other was rough cast,
Yeah.
what they call rough cast.
Yeah.
And the rain gets behind, so it goes in. And of course, modern houses now are central heating. You just pumps the water straight in.
Yeah.
And so major. And so, it's under major repair at the moment. Continues. But it's largely inside on the curtain wall, because the light was largely as it was. The rooms, shape of the rooms, windows, have been put, because it's a listed building.
Yeah.
The windows have been put back, to the manner that they were. In memory, anyway. Interestingly, the picture that showed it with 4 towers, which might have been artistic license.
Yes.
I think originally you only had 2 towers.
Yeah.
And there was the wing that faces. Part of it was built on, and the other bit, which is actually the caretaker's quarters, flat for the housekeeper.
I think the artist Farrington just wanted a complete castle. He doesn't, I think, want to admit that this is actually, a perfectly ordinary house in which ordinary hunting parties might gather. So, his picture is a bit fantasist, isn't it? And I'm not totally convinced that the mountain behind looks all that much like Green Hill. There's an awful lot of rather steep and unlikely looking cliffs up there.
I'm just wondering whether you'd be interested in sharing some of these stories of your own personal stories of working on the tower in our website, because you have a very precious knowledge base there, and wonderful if you could share that knowledge. Indeed, to create some sort of dialogue between the owner and us as well, or others, because I'm sure everyone walking along the Ullswater Way wonders what this building is, and of course it's completely secluded, and normal people don't have access.
It's a private house, of course.
Sure.
It's in a public place, it's a private house. And I mean, the people are only aware of your lecture, and so
They're aware of the talk tonight.
They were aware. I mean,
I see.
actually,
Okay.
I was actually there.
I would really love to meet them. As I say, I did try, but
You know,
He was intending to come along at the Zoom, but I think he's held up by the tube strike.
We're just having a comment from Zoom. Can you read on?
Well, there's a comment here from Tracy Bevan. I've lived at Lyulph's Tower for over 20 years and I've never seen any ghosts.
oh bother! I was hoping for ghosts.
Apparently visible. But I've never seen.
That's the trouble with ghosts, isn't it? You hear about them, but they never appear. It's really irritating.
I've been in a house, worked in a house in the Follies, and I didn't believe it, but it put my hair on it. And I realised I had hair in place I didn't know I had hair. And that's a known fact. There's an old cottage, you know, and it was haunted, generally known, and unbeknown to me, of course, and working the place, tore it apart, and I don't think Ross is very happy.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Miles?
Just ask about pronunciation, because I've always called it Lyulph. I called it that. Maybe the locals call it Lyulph, but you're calling it.
Yeah, I'm slightly in the same boat as you, to be honest. I mean, I started by calling it Lyulph's Tower. Then somebody rather authoritative happened to mention Lyulph's Tower, so I thought I'd better conform. It's not obvious to me what the pronunciation would be, except that I don't think that if it is a Saxon name, which it presumably is, I'm not sure that the vowel I exists, so Lyulph would probably be more authentic. But as I say, I'm no more authoritative than you are.
Any more questions? Yes, Emma.
Just an observation, really. So when the National Trust bought Era Force beginning of the 20th century, the Howards obviously kept Lyulph's Tower and the surrounding area. So I think it's really hard for us in modern times to appreciate quite how it was for those early tours, because we see the sort of focus as the car park at Era Force, and you walk up to the force itself. But I suspect that the tourists probably came to the lake shore, sort of maybe nearer the castle, and they started there, and then made their way up to the sort of more daring parts. And so I think because it was split, that experience has just gone.
I think also, don't you, that 18th century walkers, because you see pictures of nicely dressed ladies walking around. They can't often have been walking around something like
it's been extraordinary for them to actually, because there are pictures, obviously not quite that, but the late pictures, Victorian ones, but of the ladies in their skirts and their little boots. Because there weren't steps in those days, just on the rocks, but it was very brave.
It is. It struck me how very enterprising it must have been. I can't find anything exactly comparable elsewhere in the country. Another park, as it were, that had been converted like that into something which actually is a wee bit dangerous, isn't it? You trip and you end up in the river. Well, yes, I think it's that, isn't it? It's the sort of pleasure of terror.
Yes.
You walk across those bridges thinking, if I put my foot wrong here, I'm in the falls.
Interestingly, there's actually a bridge lower down the area. The buildings that are now occupied by the National Trust offices. In front of there, between there and the car park, is a park horse bridge.
Yeah.
There's no signs on it, just the main structure.
Yeah.
And there's evidence of a road which leads to that, heading up towards where the tower is.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if that was the original Roman that followed up there.
The original site, would the wood really survive, a couple of hundred years, just about?
It might have been rebuilt, but it's still there.
Yes, indeed, yes, yes.
It
Doesn't look nearly as rickety as the bridge in those pictures, in those 18th century pictures.
It is kind of a road from the offices to the main
Yeah.
visitor centre.
Yeah.
It's not used by the public.
No.
It's like,
No.
you know,
No, you can just see it, can't you, when you're coming down towards the offices? Yeah.
yeah.
Are there any comments from the Zoom call?
Just one comment here that Martin Butcher saying, Chiswick House was the Duke of Devonshire's, not the Duke of Bedford. The lawn of Chatsworth was laid out as a ground plan, reminding them of their London pad.
Oh dear. Apologies, folks, and apologies to whoever the person is.
Martin.
I think
Martin Butcher is
Mhm.
local. Yeah. Any other comments? I mean, personally, I'd be very interested to do a tour of that sort. I have no idea whether such a thing is feasible. Who has to, whose permission you have to get authorization for and so on. But, I mean, it's such a unique set of structures, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, you could walk between them. Fort Putnam is fairly clear that it's private, but that doesn't mean that they might not accept, as it were, a guaranteed group going and having a little walk. And you could walk more or less between them. You'd go, unfortunately, you'd have to walk a bit along the road, I think.
How many owners are involved and would be involved in such a walk?
I think there's two owner families, as it were. Bunkers Hill is different. It is actually a commercial place, so I suspect they'd be quite happy because it's a way of finding customers, isn't it?
We've got Daniel in the back of the
I
court.
know the owners of, well, I think he's the tenant of Spa House.
Oh, do you?
If anybody wants to look around, I'm happy to introduce them.
That would be excellent. Yes, please.
Okay, you are.
Can I ask you another question? When did all this end? There was obviously feverish activity in the 18th century and early part of the 19th, but then it stopped the notion of building follies, or is it the planning rules were introduced and it became too difficult and complicated?
I think people just ran out, partly, no doubt, ran out of inspiration. I mean, what you don't want to do if you're building your personal folly is to be copying somebody else's folly. You know, the whole point is to be able to say, look at my new and glorious and extraordinary folly. But I think, don't you, that the moves are, towards the Victorian period still, of course, was building mock medieval Gothic buildings, but not necessarily follies. I think it was a bit more utilitarian.
Okay. Any more comments from Zoom? So I think we should raise our hands to you again for that very inspiring talk. And it's a bit like gold dust to have someone within the room who actually has such great experience. It'd be wonderful to exchange contacts and see whether we can profit from that. Our next speaker is Judith Cook, who is the chair of the Friends of the Lake District. She's going to talk on the Friends of the Lake District. What does it do in the Ullswater area? So she's going to give us some inspiration of its function, how it works. The talk is going to take place in Glenridding Village Hall on the 5th of April. One comment briefly on donations. We have a tradition, as you know, that we request the speaker to nominate a charity that you'd like any contributions that either from this hall or online we would receive. Do you have any chosen charity?
The obvious one at the moment, isn't it, is the Disasters Emergency Committee, the UK's Disasters Emergency Committee, which is asking for donations for the support of Ukraine.
I think that's a fantastic.
I think the government's matching it too.
Yes, they are.
Yes.
Sorry, I should have said that. You're right.
Yes.
So every pound that is given, they will add another pound.
That's a wonderful idea. Thank you very much indeed for that. We've all been so moved, haven't we, over the last 3 weeks. So thank you for that. And we The previous speaker, we managed to provide £163 to the Addington Fund, which supports farmers, and we're very pleased by that. So, without further ado, I just give my best wishes to Gordon, who has been nominated earlier this morning as the new chair of Friends of the Ullswater Way. It comes full circle because Gordon was one of the founding members, and another founding member of Miles is in the room today as well. So it's wonderful to see you in the seat after seeing the creation of the Friends of the Ullswater Way in 2016, and now taking on the role as chair. Thank you all very much for coming tonight.